Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into something really fascinating today, a growing tension at the very heart of the U.S. judicial system. And we're going to use a series of pretty sharp opinions from the Supreme Court itself to see what's going on.
Okay, so what could Donald Trump and some Supreme Court justices possibly have in common? I know, it sounds like the setup to a joke, right? But the answer actually gets to the very core of a conflict that's been simmering for a while now. A conflict between the highest court in the land and all the federal courts below it.
The answer is frustration, a shared frustration with lower court judges. Both the former president and several of the court's conservative justices have been pretty vocal about their irritation. And this summer, that feeling didn't just simmer, it boiled over in some seriously pointed and forceful legal opinions.
All right, so let's break this down. First, we need to understand the situation from the perspective of the court's conservative wing. What they see is a pattern of, well, what they're calling outright defiance.
I mean, take this quote from Justice Neil Gorsuch. It's a pretty stark warning, right? His point is simple. There's a clear hierarchy here. The Supreme Court sets the precedent, and it is the non-negotiable duty of every single lower court to follow it. It doesn't matter if they personally agree with it or not.
And look, this wasn't just a one-off comment. Justice Samuel Alito used even stronger language, calling a federal judge's ruling an act of judicial hubris and self-aggrandizement. So he's not just saying these decisions are wrong, he's framing them as arrogant overreaches of power.
So to back this up, Gorsuch points to a specific pattern. He said that in just a few weeks, the Supreme Court had to step in 3 different times on cases they felt were already settled by their own past rulings. For them, this is basically proof, evidence that lower courts are just ignoring clear instructions from the top.
But, and this is a big but, that is only one side of the coin. There's a powerful and sharply contrasting view coming from the court's liberal justices, and they paint a completely different picture of what's going on.
Just listen to this dissent from Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She basically flips the entire argument on its head. She's saying the problem isn't defiance from the lower courts. The problem is that the Supreme Court's majority is actually rewarding the administration for ignoring lower court orders, and that, she says, erodes the rule of law. Then you have Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who came up with maybe the most memorable critique of all. She accused the majority of engaging in, get this, Calvin ball jurisprudence. What she's saying is the court isn't using consistent legal rules anymore, they're just making sure a certain side always wins. Now, for anyone who might not know, Calvin ball comes from the amazing comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. It's a game where the only real rule is that you can make up new rules at any time. The rules are always changing to help whoever is playing. So you can see why this is such a powerful accusation, right? When Justice Jackson says they're playing Calvin ball, she's suggesting the highest court in the country is just making up the rules as it goes along, with one simple goal, making sure the administration wins. And all of this heated debate, all this talk of defiance and Calvin ball, it all leads us to the real root of the conflict. It's a legal tool that most people have never heard of, but it's at the center of everything, the emergency docket. Okay, so what is the emergency docket? Think of it like the Supreme Court's express lane, or its ER. It's for urgent requests, and it lets the court make a quick call on what should happen while the full case is still being argued in the lower courts. The key things to remember: these rulings are fast, and they often come with little to no explanation. Now here's where it gets really interesting. There's been a major shift in how the court talks about these rulings. You see, Justice Alito himself used to argue that these fast-track orders do not create binding precedent. But now, the current majority seems to be saying that, well, yeah, they kind of should, that they should inform how lower courts decide things. CNN's Supreme Court analyst Steve Vladek summed up the problem perfectly. He basically said the Supreme Court is giving these one-line answers with no explanation and then getting angry at the lower courts for not being able to read their minds. That, he says, is the real hubris here. So when you take a step back, you realize this isn't just some technical legal squabble. This whole back and forth gets at a much bigger, more fundamental question. What is the role of a judge in our system of government? And look, the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about public trust in the entire judiciary. We're talking about the separation of powers. It's about the very definition of the rule of law and whether we have truly independent federal judges. It's a tension that Justice Brett Kavanaugh seemed to touch on recently. He said very plainly, we're not the policymakers. His point was that judges need to remember their job is to interpret the law, not to make it.
And that, right there, is the heart of this whole thing. It brings us to the central question, especially in such a divided country. Where is that line between interpreting the law and making it? And maybe more importantly, who gets to decide when it's been crossed?